Welcome to History Before Sleep Stories. Here we travel through the shadows of time, softly, slowly, carefully, so you can fall asleep with a mind full of wonder. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the past begin to unfold. There are stories that refuse to die, tales that persist across millennia, narratives that capture human imagination so completely that they survive the collapse of civilizations and the transformation of cultures, passing from generation to generation, changing in the retelling, but never disappearing entirely. And among these enduring stories, few have proven more captivating than the tale of Atlantis, the lost island civilization that supposedly vanished beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day and night, leaving behind only memories and mysteries and endless speculation about whether it was real or invented, history or allegory, truth or beautiful fiction, designed to illustrate philosophical principles. The story comes to us primarily through the writings of Plato, the Greek philosopher who lived from approximately 427 to 347 BCE. And who recorded the tale of Atlantis in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE when Plato was in his 60s or 70s and had already established himself as one of the most important philosophers of the ancient world. These dialogues, particularly the account in the Timaeus and the more detailed but unfinished description in the Critias, remain our primary, and in many ways our only reliable ancient source for the Atlantis story, and examining what Plato actually wrote, distinguishing his words from the countless interpretations and elaborations that have been added over the centuries, represents the essential first step in understanding this enduring mystery. Before we dive into Plato's text, before we analyze what he said and how he said it and what he might have meant, we must acknowledge the mythology that has grown around Atlantis, the vast accumulation of speculation and theory and outright fabrication that has transformed Plato's relatively brief account into an entire genre of literature and pseudo-history, because this mythology, while often detached from what ancient texts actually say, shapes how modern readers approach the original sources and what they expect to find there. The modern mythology of Atlantis developed primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries, though with roots extending back further, portrays the lost civilization as technologically advanced, far beyond what conventional archaeology attributes to ancient societies possessing flying machines and crystal power sources and sophisticated weapons, practicing advanced forms of spirituality, or possessing psychic abilities, building monuments that could not be replicated, even with modern technology, and maintaining a global empire or at least extensive trade networks connecting distant continents. And this advanced civilization was supposedly destroyed either through natural catastrophe or through its own moral decay and misuse of technology, leaving survivors who spread across the world and founded the great civilizations of antiquity, carrying with them fragments of Atlantean knowledge that would manifest in the pyramids of Egypt and the megalithic structures of South America and the mysterious artifacts that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. None of this elaborate mythology appears in Plato's text. The actual account in the Timaeus and Critias is both more modest and more specific than the modern Atlantis mythology suggests, describing a powerful naval empire that existed approximately 9,000 years before Plato's time, located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we identify as the Strait of Gibraltar. And this empire, according to Plato's account, attempted to conquer the Mediterranean world, but was defeated by ancient Athens, and then both the Atlantean Empire and the victorious Athenian society were destroyed in a single day and night through earthquakes and floods that caused Atlantis to sink beneath the sea, while simultaneously devastating the Greek mainland. Plato presents this story not as his own invention, but as an account that came down through generations, supposedly originating with Solon, one of Athens' most famous lawgivers who lived in the 6th century BCE, approximately 250 years before Plato's time, and Solon, according to Plato's account, heard the story from Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt. And these priests, custodians of records extending back thousands of years, told Solon about ancient events that the Greeks had forgotten because their civilization had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, while Egypt, protected by the Nile and its unique geography, had maintained continuous records reaching back into deep time. This chain of transmission, Solon to his family to eventually Plato's relative Critias, who recounts it in the dialogues, raises immediate questions about reliability and authenticity. Did Solon really visit Egypt and hear this story from priests? Did those priests really possess records of events 9,000 years in their past? Did Plato receive an accurate account of what Solon supposedly heard, transmitted through multiple generations? Or did Plato invent the entire attribution to Solon and the Egyptian priests in order to lend authority to what was actually his own philosophical invention? These questions have been debated for more than 2,000 years, and we will return to them, but first we must examine what Plato actually wrote, reading his words carefully, noting what he includes and what he omits, analyzing the structure and purpose of the dialogues in which the Atlantis story appears, because only by understanding the text itself can we begin to evaluate the various interpretations and theories that have been proposed about its meaning and its relationship to historical reality. The Timaeus begins with Socrates, Plato's teacher, and the central figure in most of his dialogues, requesting that his companions provide an account of an ideal state in action, showing how the principles of justice and governance that had been discussed in previous conversations would actually function in historical circumstances. Critias, one of the participants in the dialogue, responds by saying he will relate a story that is both strange and absolutely true. A story that Solon heard from Egyptian priests and told to Critias' great-grandfather, who passed it down through the family. Critias recounts how Solon, during his travels in Egypt, visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta and spoke with learned priests there, and when Solon tried to engage the priests in discussion of ancient history by recounting Greek legends about the flood and about early kings, the priests responded by saying that the Greeks were like children, possessing no ancient learning and no traditions extending back into deep time, because Greek civilization had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times through catastrophes, and each time the written records and the educated classes were lost, leaving only scattered survivors who had to rebuild from nearly nothing, forgetting the achievements and knowledge of previous ages. The priests told Solon that Egyptian records, by contrast, extended back many thousands of years, preserved in temple archives and in the collective memory maintained by the priestly class. And these records contained accounts of events that the Greeks had forgotten or transformed into myths, including a great war that occurred 9,000 years earlier, before any of the catastrophes that had destroyed Greek civilization and erased Greek memory. And in this ancient war, Athens, then a powerful and well-governed city embodying principles of justice and military virtue, had defeated an invasion by a vast empire based on an island called Atlantis. The priests described Atlantis as an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the ocean that bears its name. And from this island, the Atlantean kings ruled over many other islands and over parts of the continent beyond, and their power extended into the Mediterranean as far as Egypt and Italy. And they attempted to conquer the entire region, enslaving free peoples and extending their empire. But they were opposed and defeated by Athens, which led a coalition of Greek cities in successful resistance. After this victory, however, a great catastrophe struck, violent earthquakes and floods occurring in a single day and night. And the Athenian army was swallowed by the earth, and the island of Atlantis sank into the sea and disappeared. And ever since that time, the ocean in that region has been impassable and unsearchable because of the mud and shallow water that remains where the island once stood, preventing navigation beyond the Pillars of Heracles. This is the account given in the Timaeus, relatively brief, providing the basic outline of the story, but few details about Atlantean civilization itself, and the dialogue then moves on to other topics, primarily cosmology and the nature of the physical universe, and the Atlantis story serves mainly as introduction and example of the kind of historical narrative that Socrates had requested, demonstrating how an ideal state might actually function in concrete circumstances. The Critias, which was apparently intended as a sequel developing the Atlantis story in greater detail, provides much more information about the geography, political organization, architecture, and customs of both Atlantis and ancient Athens. But this dialogue is unfinished, breaking off in mid-sentence, and we do not know whether Plato ever completed it or intended to complete it, or whether the abrupt ending reflects some external circumstance like his death, or whether he decided for philosophical or literary reasons to leave the work incomplete. And this unfinished state has contributed to the mystery surrounding Atlantis, leaving readers to wonder what additional information Plato might have provided and whether the conclusion would have offered clearer indication of whether he considered the story historical or fictional. The Critias begins with Critias apologizing for the difficulty of the task he has undertaken, explaining that it is harder to describe historical events convincingly than to discuss divine matters, because audiences judge historical accounts by their own experience and knowledge and will notice errors and implausibilities, while divine matters, being removed from ordinary experience, can be discussed more freely without fear of contradiction. And this meta-commentary on the nature of historical narrative might be Plato's way of signaling that the account should be read with critical attention to its plausibility and internal consistency. Critias then provides a detailed description of ancient Athens as it supposedly existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, before the catastrophe that destroyed it and erased memory of its achievements. This ancient Athens was organized according to principles of justice and military virtue, with a class of warriors devoted to defending the city and living communally without private property, supported by farmers and craftsmen who lived separately. And this social organization mirrors the ideal state described in Plato's Republic, leading many readers to conclude that the Athens described in the Critias is not a historical society, but Plato's ideal state projected backward into mythical antiquity to illustrate how such a state might function. The description of ancient Athens is followed by a much longer and more detailed account of Atlantis, its geography, its political structure, its architecture and engineering works, its customs and way of life, and its eventual moral decline that led to divine punishment. This description begins with a mythological origin story explaining how the god Poseidon received Atlantis as his portion when the gods divided the earth among themselves, and Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito and married her, and had 5 sets of twin sons. And he divided the island among these 10 sons, making the eldest, Atlas, the supreme king, and giving him the central and most important portion of the island, while the others received territories of their own and became subordinate kings. And from Atlas the island took its name, and the ocean surrounding it was called Atlantic. The central plain of Atlantis was described as rectangular, measuring 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, surrounded by mountains that descended to the sea. And this plain was the most fertile and beautiful region, well watered by rivers, flowing from the mountains and carefully cultivated by the inhabitants. And at the center of this plain, 50 stadia from the coast, stood a hill where Cleito had lived before Poseidon married her. And Poseidon enclosed this hill with alternating rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land, and 3 rings of water, evenly spaced and turned as if on a lathe, creating a natural fortress that was inaccessible in the era before ships. The later kings of Atlantis built extensive structures on this circular island, constructing bridges across the rings of water, digging a canal from the sea through the rings to create a harbor at the center, and building walls around each ring, covering the walls with metals including bronze and tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum that was found only in Atlantis and was considered more precious than anything except gold. And the royal palace stood at the very center on the original hill, constantly enlarged and beautified by successive generations of kings who competed to surpass their predecessors, creating a structure of extraordinary magnificence that reflected the wealth and power of the Atlantean Empire. The description continues with details about the engineering works, including a great canal that ran from the city to the sea, 50 stadia in length. And this canal was deep enough and wide enough for large ships to pass through to the inner harbor. And there were docks and shipyards within the rings of water, and the outer ring was connected to the sea by a channel 300 feet wide. And all of this infrastructure supported the Atlantean Navy, which was the foundation of their military power and the means by which they controlled their empire. The plains beyond the royal city were divided by a grid of canals that provided irrigation for agriculture and transportation for produce, and these canals connected to the main canal leading to the sea, allowing ships to penetrate far inland and collect the agricultural surplus that supported the urban population and the military forces. And the entire plain was organized for maximum agricultural productivity, divided into allotments assigned to military commanders who were responsible for providing soldiers and resources in proportion to their holdings, creating a system that combined economic efficiency with military mobilization. The military organization of Atlantis is described in detail, specifying the numbers of chariots and cavalry and infantry and ships that could be mobilized from different districts. And these numbers are very large, suggesting an empire of enormous population and resources. And the description emphasizes the naval power particularly, noting that Atlantis controlled 1,200 warships and the sailors to man them, reflecting the island's maritime character and its dependence on sea power to maintain control over its far-flung possessions. The political organization combined monarchy with constitutional limits. The 10 kings descended from Poseidon's original sons ruled their respective territories, but met regularly to consult on matters affecting the entire confederation, and they were bound by laws that Poseidon had established at the beginning and that were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon at the center of the royal city. And these laws governed relations among the kings and prescribed how disputes should be resolved and how the king should conduct themselves, emphasizing justice and virtue and self-restraint. And every 5th and 6th year, alternately, the kings would gather to sacrifice bulls and renew their commitment to these laws. The ritual described for these gatherings is elaborate and specific. The kings would hunt bulls that ran free in the temple precinct using only wooden clubs and nooses, no metal weapons. And when they captured a bull, they would lead it to the pillar, inscribed with laws, and sacrifice it over the pillar so that the blood ran over the inscription. And then they would mix portions of the bull's blood in a bowl of wine and pour libations and swear to judge according to the laws on the pillar and to punish any violations they detected in one another. And after these ceremonies, they would conduct their deliberations about common concerns, delivering judgments and writing their decisions on golden tablets. This detailed description of constitutional procedures and religious rituals lends a kind of verisimilitude to the account, suggesting institutional sophistication and cultural traditions that would have required long development. And Plato emphasizes that Atlantis was initially governed with wisdom and virtue, the kings restraining their ambitions and maintaining just relations with one another and with their subjects, and as long as the divine nature remained strong in them, they prospered and held their power with moderation. But gradually, as the divine portion was diluted by repeated mixture with mortal elements across many generations, they became more human and less divine, dominated by greed and ambition, and this moral decline manifested in their attempt to conquer territories beyond their island and extend their rule over the entire Mediterranean world. Zeus, observing this moral corruption, decided to punish the Atlanteans to recall them to virtue, and he summoned the other gods to his dwelling to announce his decision. And at this point, just as Zeus is about to speak, the Critias breaks off abruptly, and we never learn what Zeus said or how the punishment was carried out or what happened in the war between Atlantis and ancient Athens. And this dramatic cliffhanger has frustrated readers for 2,000 years and has encouraged endless speculation about what Plato might have written if he had completed the dialogue. Having examined what Plato actually wrote about Atlantis, noting both what he included and what he omitted, we can now step back and consider the interpretive questions that this text raises. The most fundamental question, debated since antiquity, is whether Plato intended the Atlantis story to be understood as historical fact or as philosophical fiction, whether he was preserving an authentic ancient tradition that had come down to him through Solon and the Egyptian priests, or whether he invented the entire story to illustrate philosophical and political principles. Arguments that Plato invented Atlantis as philosophical fiction focus on several features of the account. First, the numbers and time scale seem implausibly large. 9,000 years before Solon would place Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, which is in the Neolithic period, long before the development of writing or complex urban civilizations as far as archaeology can determine. And while it is possible that sophisticated societies existed in this remote period and left no traces that modern archaeology has discovered, this seems unlikely given how thoroughly archaeologists have surveyed many regions, and more probably, Plato simply chose a very remote time period to place his story beyond the reach of verification or falsification. Second, The description of ancient Athens that appears in the Critias mirrors the ideal state described in Plato's Republic too closely to be coincidental. The class structure and communal living and military virtues all correspond to Plato's philosophical principles rather than to what we know about actual ancient societies, suggesting that Plato was projecting his ideal state backward into mythical history rather than describing a real historical Athens. Third, the story serves Plato's philosophical purposes too perfectly, illustrating themes that appear throughout his work, including the importance of justice and virtue in both individual and collective life, the dangers of moral decline and excessive ambition, the need for constitutional restraints on power, the relationship between human and divine nature, and the transience of even the greatest civilizations. And this thematic coherence suggests that Plato designed the story to convey specific lessons rather than simply recording historical events. Fourth, no mention of Atlantis appears in any source earlier than Plato, despite the fact that Greek literature and historical writing from the archaic and early classical periods is relatively abundant. And if the story had really come down from Solon, who was famous and whose poetry and legal work were well known in classical Athens, we would expect other references to it in earlier texts, and the absence of such references suggests that Plato invented the attribution to Solon to lend authority to what was actually his own creation. Fifth, Plato explicitly uses myths and fictional stories in other dialogues to illustrate philosophical points, most famously the allegory of the cave in the Republic, but also the myth of at the end of the same work and various other mythological materials scattered throughout his writings. And for Plato, myth was a legitimate philosophical tool, a way of presenting truths that could not be expressed through purely logical argument. And the Atlantis story fits this pattern of using narrative to convey philosophical content that resists direct statement. Arguments that Plato was recording authentic historical tradition, by contrast, emphasize different aspects of the text. First, Plato explicitly and repeatedly asserts that the story is true, having Critias declare at the beginning of the Timaeus that the account is strange but absolutely true. And while Plato certainly could have lied or could have intended this assertion of truth to be understood metaphorically as referring to philosophical truth rather than historical truth, the emphasis on truthfulness is striking and should be taken seriously. Second, the level of detail in the descriptions, particularly in the Critias, exceeds what would be necessary if the story were simply allegorical invention. Plato specifies measurements and distances and numbers with apparent precision, describing architectural features and political institutions and religious ceremonies in ways that suggest he was working from some kind of source material rather than creating everything from imagination. And while detailed fictional invention was certainly possible in the ancient world, the specificity of Plato's account makes some readers think he was describing something he believed to be real. Third, some elements of the story do not obviously serve Plato's philosophical purposes and might be authentic historical memories preserved in tradition. For example, the detail about the ocean being impassable beyond the Pillars of Heracles because of mud and shallow water, which does not contribute to the moral lesson about pride and divine punishment, but might reflect ancient knowledge about the Atlantic Ocean that was not commonly known in Plato's time. Fourth, Egyptian civilization did maintain extensive records and did have priestly classes who preserved traditional knowledge across many generations. And while we have no Egyptian texts that mention Atlantis or corroborate Plato's account, this absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Many ancient texts have been lost, and it is at least possible that some tradition about Atlantic islands or ancient catastrophes was preserved in Egyptian sources and communicated to Solon. Fifth, geological and archaeological research has discovered that significant environmental changes did occur in the Mediterranean region and the Atlantic around the end of the last ice age, approximately 9,000 to 12,000 years ago, including rising sea levels that flooded coastal areas and low-lying islands. And while these changes occurred more gradually than Plato's account of sudden catastrophe suggests, they might have provided the historical basis for legends about disappearing lands and great floods, and Plato's story could be a garbled memory of real events transmitted through countless generations. The debate between these interpretations, between reading Atlantis as philosophical fiction and reading it as distorted historical memory, cannot be conclusively resolved based on the text alone, different readers emphasizing different features and reaching different conclusions based on their prior assumptions about Plato's purposes and about the reliability of oral tradition in preserving accurate information across long time periods. And the question remains open, though most contemporary. Scholars lean toward the fictional interpretation, treating Atlantis as Plato's philosophical invention rather than as genuine historical tradition. But our investigation need not end with Plato's text, for we can examine other ancient sources that mention Atlantis or related traditions, seeing whether they provide independent corroboration of Plato's account or whether they simply repeat or elaborate on what Plato wrote. And we can look at modern archaeological and geological evidence to assess whether physical traces of Atlantis or analogous civilizations have been discovered, and through this broader examination, we can develop a more complete understanding of what ancient texts really say about Atlantis and how this evidence relates to the enduring mystery. The search for ancient sources beyond Plato that mention Atlantis or similar traditions reveals a surprisingly limited corpus of material, and examining this evidence carefully demonstrates that almost all subsequent ancient references to Atlantis derive directly from Plato's dialogues rather than representing independent traditions. And this pattern itself tells us something important about how the Atlantis story developed and spread through ancient literature. Aristotle, who was Plato's student for approximately 20 years and who must have been familiar with his teacher's writings, including the Timaeus and Critias, never explicitly discusses Atlantis in his surviving works, and while some later. Commentators claim that Aristotle regarded the Atlantis story as Plato's invention. The passages supposedly supporting this interpretation are ambiguous and may refer to other fictional elements in Plato's work, rather than specifically to Atlantis. And in any case, Aristotle's silence on the subject, if indeed he considered it worth commenting on, and if such comments existed in works that have not survived, does not prove anything definitively about whether Atlantis was historical or invented. Though some interpreters take his apparent lack of interest as suggesting he did not consider the story credible. Crantor of Soli, who lived approximately 320 to 270 BCE and was the first known philosopher to write a commentary on Plato's Timaeus, reportedly stated that the Atlantis story was historical and that Egyptian priests in Sais still possessed the columns or stelae on which the account was inscribed, though we know about Crantor's views only through much later sources, particularly Proclus, who wrote in the 5th century CE, more than 700 years after. Crantor and Proclus may have misunderstood or misrepresented what Crantor actually wrote, and in any case, Crantor himself never claimed to have seen these Egyptian records personally. He apparently relied on the authority of Plato's text and on the general plausibility of Egyptian priests maintaining ancient records, and his testimony, filtered through late ancient sources, provides weak evidence for the historical reality of Atlantis. Posidonius, a Stoic philosopher who lived approximately 135 to 51 BCE and who traveled extensively and wrote about geography and natural history, apparently discussed Atlantis in his work, and he is sometimes quoted as having said that the story might be true and that it was at least possible that large land masses could sink into the ocean, given the evidence of geological changes observable in various regions. But again, we know about Posidonius's views primarily through later sources who may have interpreted his cautious acknowledgement of geological possibility as endorsement of the Atlantis story specifically, and reading the fragments of Posidonius that survive suggests he was more interested in general questions about changing geography than in validating Plato's particular account. Strabo, the geographer who lived approximately 64 BCE to 24 CE and who wrote an extensive work describing the known world, mentions Atlantis briefly in the context of discussing Plato, and notes that some people consider the story historical while others regard it as invented. But Strabo himself does not commit to either interpretation, and his treatment is so cursory that it provides little insight beyond confirming that the question of Atlantis's historicity was already being debated in his time, approximately 3 centuries after Plato wrote the dialogues. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian who lived 23 to 79 CE and who compiled an enormous encyclopedia of knowledge covering geography, zoology, botany, mineralogy, and many other subjects, mentions legends about disappearing islands in the Atlantic Ocean, but does not specifically link these to Plato's Atlantis, and his brief allusions to vanished lands probably reflect the tendency of ancient geographers to believe that coastal configurations and island positions changed over time through natural processes, a belief that was reasonable given observable evidence of erosion and deposition and volcanic activity. But connecting these general observations to Plato's specific story requires interpretive leaps that the ancient sources do not explicitly make. Plutarch, who lived approximately 46 to 120 CE and who wrote biographical and philosophical works, mentions Atlantis in his biography of Solon in the context of discussing Solon's planned epic poem about Atlantis that supposedly he never completed, and Plutarch presents this as historical fact, stating that Solon heard the story in Egypt and intended to write a great poem about it, but was prevented by old age and political troubles. And this would seem to provide independent corroboration of Plato's attribution of the story to Solon, but Plutarch wrote more than 500 years after Solon and more than 400 years after Plato, and he may have simply taken Plato's account at face value and elaborated on it rather than possessing independent information about Solon's activities. And reading Plutarch carefully reveals that he tends to accept traditional stories without critical examination when they make his biographical subjects seem more interesting or admirable. Proclus, the Neoplatonist philosopher who lived 412 to 485 CE and who wrote an extensive commentary on Plato's Timaeus, provides the most detailed ancient discussion of Atlantis outside of Plato's own dialogues, and Proclus argues at length that the story is historical, citing Crantor's testimony about Egyptian records and marshaling various philosophical and mythological parallels to support the idea that advanced civilizations existed in remote antiquity. But Proclus lived approximately 800 years after Plato and wrote at a time when Neoplatonist philosophers were deeply invested in finding hidden wisdom and historical truth in Plato's writings, and his arguments, while learned and ingenious, are shaped by his philosophical commitments rather than by access to independent historical evidence, and modern scholars generally regard Proclus's historical claims about Atlantis as unreliable, reflecting his desire to defend Plato's authority, rather than demonstrating genuine knowledge of ancient sources. This survey of ancient references to Atlantis reveals a consistent pattern. No source independent of Plato mentions the story. All subsequent discussions either derive from Plato's dialogues or represent interpretations and elaborations of his account, and even those ancient writers who claim that Atlantis was historical, like Crantor and Proclus, do not provide evidence beyond Plato's text and assertions about Egyptian records that they themselves never verified. And this pattern strongly suggests that Plato was the originator of the Atlantis story, and that it was not, as he claimed, an ancient tradition transmitted through Solon from Egyptian sources, but rather his own philosophical invention that later readers sometimes interpreted, literally, despite Plato's possible intention that it be read allegorically. But the absence of ancient sources confirming Atlantis does not necessarily prove it never existed. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and it remains at least theoretically possible that Plato preserved an authentic tradition that was not recorded in other surviving texts. And to assess this possibility, we must turn to archaeological and geological evidence, examining whether physical traces of Atlantis or analogous civilizations have been discovered, and whether Plato's account, when examined carefully, contains details that might point to real historical events or places. The search for physical evidence of Atlantis has generated countless expeditions and excavations over the centuries, and various sites have been proposed as possible locations, including the Atlantic Ocean beyond Gibraltar, as Plato stated, the Mediterranean region where advanced Bronze Age civilizations did exist, and even more exotic locations in the Americas or Antarctica. And examining the most prominent theories reveals both the appeal of the Atlantis mystery and the difficulty of finding convincing physical evidence to support any particular identification. The most popular modern theory identifies Atlantis with the Minoan civilization that flourished on Crete and surrounding islands in the Aegean Sea during the Bronze Age, particularly focusing on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, which experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE that destroyed the island's Bronze Age settlement and generated tsunamis that devastated coastal areas around the eastern Mediterranean. And this theory, first proposed seriously in the late 19th century and developed extensively in the 20th, argues that Plato's account preserves distorted memories of this real historical catastrophe, with the time scale and location altered through transmission across many centuries. The Minoan identification is attractive because it links Atlantis to a real advanced civilization that did suffer catastrophic destruction, and archaeological excavations on Crete and Santorini have revealed sophisticated urban centers with multi-story buildings, advanced plumbing systems, beautiful frescoes depicting maritime scenes and religious ceremonies, and extensive trade networks connecting the Aegean with Egypt and the Near East. And these archaeological discoveries demonstrate that Bronze Age Aegean societies were far more advanced than scholars had previously believed, with levels of civilization that might seem to justify terms like legendary or lost. And the Thera eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, certainly would have seemed catastrophic to contemporary observers and might well have generated legends that persisted for centuries. However, the Minoan theory faces significant problems when we examine it against Plato's text. Plato explicitly places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Aegean. And while some defenders of the Minoan theory argue that this location was changed or confused during transmission of the story, this requires assuming that Plato or his sources made major errors in geography, which weakens the claim that his account preserves authentic historical information. The time scale is also problematic. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, approximately 9,600 BCE, while the Thera eruption occurred around 1,600 BCE, a discrepancy of 8,000 years that cannot be explained away by assuming Plato confused years with months or by other mathematical manipulations that have been attempted. Moreover, the Minoan civilization, while advanced for its time, does not match many of Plato's specific descriptions of Atlantis. The Minoans were not organized as a confederation of 10 kings, as Plato describes. They did not control territory extending to Egypt and Italy. Their architecture, while impressive, did not include the concentric rings of land and water that Plato describes in detail, and their agricultural system did not match Plato's account of the Atlantean plain with its grid of canals. And while defenders of the theory argue that these discrepancies resulted from distortion during transmission or from Plato embellishing the core story, each additional discrepancy that must be explained away weakens the identification, and at some point we must ask whether a theory that requires discarding or reinterpreting most of Plato's specific details actually explains the Atlantis story or simply uses it as inspiration for connecting other historical events to a famous name. Alternative theories have placed Atlantis in numerous other locations. Some researchers argue for locations in the Atlantic Ocean, either on the mid-Atlantic ridge where tectonic activity could theoretically have created temporary islands that later sank, or in shallower waters near the Azores or Canary Islands or other Atlantic island groups, or even in the Americas, where some theorists identify Atlantis with ancient American civilizations like the Maya or with the Caribbean basin. And these theories have the advantage of respecting Plato's stated location beyond the Pillars of Heracles, but they face the problem that no archaeological evidence of advanced Bronze Age or earlier civilizations has been found in these regions despite extensive exploration, and geological evidence indicates that no large land mass has sunk in the Atlantic Ocean within the time frame that would be relevant to Plato's account. The ocean floor is too deep, and the geological processes that create and destroy land masses operate too slowly for Atlantis-scale disappearances to occur in human historical or even prehistoric times. Other theories place Atlantis in various Mediterranean locations, including the Strait of Gibraltar region, where recent underwater surveys have identified interesting geological formations that some interpret as possible ruins, or in North Africa, where some researchers claim to find connections between Plato's account and the Sahara Desert, which was wetter and more habitable in remote antiquity, or even in Northern Europe, where a creative reinterpretation of Plato's text and elaborate linguistic arguments have been used to identify Atlantis with prehistoric cultures in Scandinavia or the British Isles. And while each theory has passionate defenders who marshal evidence and arguments in its favor, none has gained acceptance among mainstream archaeologists and historians, who generally remain skeptical that Plato described any real place, rather than inventing the entire story for philosophical purposes. The recent claims by researchers, including Michael Donnellan, about underwater structures near Cadiz in southern Spain, which media reports have presented as possible evidence for Atlantis, illustrate both the enduring appeal of the mystery and the challenges of evaluating such claims. Donnellan and his team have used sonar and other remote sensing technologies to map the seafloor near Cadiz and have identified what they interpret as walls, canals, and other structures that might represent ruins of an ancient city. And they argue that this location matches Plato's description because it is near the Strait of Gibraltar and because the structures resemble the concentric rings of land and water that Plato described, and geological evidence indicates that sea levels were lower during the last ice age and that coastal areas now underwater were once dry land that could have supported human settlement. However, evaluating these claims requires careful consideration of alternative explanations. Natural geological formations can create structures that resemble human construction, particularly when viewed through sonar or other remote sensing that does not provide the clarity of direct visual inspection. And the seafloor in shallow coastal waters includes many features created by erosion, sediment deposition, ancient river channels, and other natural processes that can produce linear structures, rectangular shapes, and even patterns that seem too regular to be natural, and without direct examination through excavation and recovery of artifacts. It is impossible to determine whether underwater features represent human construction or natural formations, and the history of underwater archaeology includes numerous false alarms, where supposed ruins turned out to be natural rock formations or modern debris. Moreover, even if the structures near Cadiz do represent ancient human construction, this would not automatically confirm that they are Atlantis. Many ancient settlements existed along Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, and some have been submerged by rising sea levels, and finding one underwater ruin does not validate all of Plato's specific details about Atlantean civilization, its political organization, its military campaigns, its moral decline, and divine punishment. And we must be careful not to engage in confirmation bias, seeing what we want to see in ambiguous evidence and ignoring details that do not fit our preferred interpretation. The proper scientific approach to such claims requires patience and systematic investigation, detailed mapping and photographic documentation of the structures, careful geological analysis to determine whether they could be natural formations, eventually excavation if that becomes feasible, and recovery of artifacts that could be dated and analyzed to determine the age and cultural context of any human presence at the site. And only through this careful process, which takes years and requires significant resources, can we determine whether underwater features represent significant archaeological discoveries or simply interesting natural formations. And preliminary sonar surveys, while exciting and worth pursuing, do not constitute proof of extraordinary claims like the discovery of Atlantis. Beyond the question of physical location and archaeological evidence, we must consider what Plato might have meant by the Atlantis story, regardless of whether it was historical. For even if Atlantis never existed as a real place, the story serves important philosophical purposes that reveal much about Plato's thinking and about ancient Greek concerns regarding civilization, justice, and the relationship between human ambition and divine order. The political and moral dimensions of the story are central to understanding it. Plato describes Atlantis as initially possessing a just and virtuous government under constitutional monarchy. With the 10 kings bound by laws inscribed on the Pillar of Heracles and required to meet regularly to renew their oaths and resolve disputes peacefully, and this system worked well as long as the divine nature remained strong in the kings, keeping them moderate and wise and focused on justice rather than merely on power and wealth. But gradually across many generations, the human element predominated over the divine, and the kings became greedy and ambitious, seeking to expand their empire and enslave other peoples. And this moral decline brought divine punishment in the form of the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis. This pattern of rise and fall of initial virtue corrupted by success and leading to catastrophic decline appears throughout Plato's work and reflects broader Greek thinking about the instability of human affairs and the dangers of hubris, the excessive pride and ambition that offends the gods and brings destruction. And in this reading, Atlantis serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when civilizations abandon justice and moderation in pursuit of power and wealth. And the story illustrates Plato's conviction that true success depends not on military power or material wealth, but on maintaining virtue and justice, which alone bring lasting stability and divine favor. The comparison between Atlantis and ancient Athens in Plato's account reinforces this moral lesson. Athens, though smaller and less powerful than Atlantis in material terms, defeats the Atlantean invasion through superior virtue and through its just political organization based on communal living among the warrior class and clear division of social functions, and this victorious Athens exemplifies Plato's ideal state as described in the Republic, suggesting that the entire Atlantis story may have been designed to demonstrate how an ideal state would function in actual historical circumstances, resisting corruption and defeating external threats through adherence to principles of justice. And the fact that both Atlantis and this ideal Athens were subsequently destroyed in the catastrophe reminds us that even the best human achievements remain vulnerable to natural forces beyond human control, introducing themes of mortality and impermanence that appear frequently in Greek thought. The religious and cosmological dimensions of the story also deserve attention. Atlantis was given to Poseidon when the gods divided the earth, and the Atlantean kings were descended from Poseidon and the mortal woman Plato, making them semi-divine and explaining their initial wisdom and virtue, and the gradual dilution of the divine element through intermarriage with mortals explains the moral decline, and this mythological framework connects the story to broader Greek ideas about the relationship between gods and humans, about the Golden Age, when gods and mortals interacted more directly and when human beings possessed qualities approaching the divine, and about the subsequent decline into the age of ordinary mortals who lack this close connection to the divine and who must rely on law and custom and philosophy to achieve wisdom that came more naturally to the heroic generation. The catastrophic ending, with Zeus deciding to punish the Atlanteans and presumably arranging the earthquakes and floods that destroyed them, reflects Greek beliefs about divine justice and about the gods' active involvement in human affairs, rewarding virtue and punishing vice. And while the Critias breaks off before Zeus speaks, the implication is clear that he ordered the destruction as punishment for Atlantean hubris and moral corruption. And this divine intervention reminds readers that human beings are not autonomous, that we live in a cosmos ordered by divine intelligence, and that violating cosmic justice brings consequences that cannot be escaped through human power or cleverness. The geographical and historical dimensions of the story, while less obviously philosophical, also contribute to its meaning and appeal. By placing Atlantis beyond the known world in the remote past, Plato freed himself from the constraints of verifiable history and geography. He could describe an ideal civilization and its moral decline without being contradicted by historical records, and he could use the vast timescale to suggest patterns that might not be visible in shorter periods. The slow corruption of virtue across many generations, the long arc of rise and fall that characterizes civilizations, and the placement beyond the Pillars of Heracles, beyond the limits of Greek exploration in Plato's time, adds an element of mystery and wonder that makes the story more compelling, suggesting that vast and unknown territories exist beyond familiar regions, and that human knowledge remains limited despite our achievements. The question of whether future exploration might discover Atlantis, either confirming or refuting Plato's account, depends on how we interpret the story and what we expect to find. If we read Atlantis as a specific historical claim about a Bronze Age or Neolithic civilization that existed beyond Gibraltar and sank beneath the ocean 9,000 years before Solon, then the prospects for discovery seem poor. Geological and archaeological evidence provides little support for such a civilization, and the absence of any traces despite extensive exploration of the Atlantic Ocean and its islands suggests that if such a place existed, it was very different from Plato's description, perhaps a small island settlement rather than a vast empire, and perhaps destroyed through more mundane processes than sudden catastrophic sinking. If instead we read Atlantis as a garbled memory of some real historical event or place, perhaps the Minoan civilization and the Thera eruption, or perhaps some other Bronze Age society that suffered catastrophe, then the discovery of Atlantis has in a sense already occurred through 20th century archaeology. We have found advanced ancient civilizations and documented catastrophic destructions, and while none matches Plato's account precisely, the general pattern he describes of flourishing, civilization followed by catastrophic decline, does appear in the archaeological record, and we can read his story as inspired by knowledge of such patterns, even if the specific details are invented or distorted. If we read Atlantis as pure philosophical fiction, as most modern scholars do, then the question of discovery becomes meaningless. There is nothing to find because Plato invented the entire story. And searching for Atlantis is like searching for the Garden of Eden or Shangri-La or any other mythical location, an entertaining exercise in imagination, but not a serious archaeological or historical project. And the value of the story lies not in its factual accuracy, but in its philosophical and literary qualities, its exploration of themes regarding justice and power and divine order and human mortality. The enduring fascination with Atlantis, which has generated thousands of books and articles and documentaries and expeditions across more than 2,000 years, reveals something important about human psychology and about our relationship with the past. We are drawn to mysteries, especially mysteries that promise hidden knowledge or lost wisdom, and the idea that an advanced civilization existed in remote antiquity and was lost, leaving only fragmentary memories and tantalizing clues, appeals to our sense that current societies and current knowledge are incomplete, that something important has been forgotten or suppressed, that if we could only recover this lost wisdom, we might solve contemporary problems or achieve capabilities that currently elude us. This psychological dimension of the Atlantis mystery helps explain why the story has proven so durable and why it continues to generate new theories and expeditions despite the lack of convincing evidence, because the search for Atlantis is not really just about finding a lost island. It is about confronting larger questions regarding human potential and human loss, about whether our species has achieved all that it is capable of, or whether past civilizations possessed knowledge and capabilities that we have lost and might recover, about whether history is progressive, with each generation building on the achievements of those who came before, or whether history is cyclical, with civilizations rising and falling and losing hard-won knowledge that later generations must rediscover or do without. The modern development of Atlantis mythology, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, added layers of meaning and speculation that went far beyond anything in Plato's text. Ignatius Donnelly's book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, published in 1882, presented Atlantis as a real historical civilization that served as the origin point for cultures across the Atlantic basin, with survivors of Atlantis's destruction sailing east to Europe and Africa and west to the Americas, and establishing the ancient civilizations whose monuments and artifacts modern archaeology was discovering. And Donnelly marshaled extensive evidence from mythology, linguistics, botany, geology, and other fields to support his theory, though his arguments, while impressively learned, relied on selective use of evidence and on assumptions about cultural diffusion that more rigorous archaeological and anthropological research has not supported. Donnelly's work sparked widespread popular interest in Atlantis and inspired countless imitators and elaborators who added their own theories and details. Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement incorporated Atlantis into their esoteric cosmology, claiming that Atlanteans were the fourth root race of humanity possessing psychic powers and advanced spiritual knowledge, and that some Atlantean wisdom had been preserved in secret teachings passed down through mystery schools and occult traditions. And while these claims had no historical basis, they influenced numerous writers and thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and contributed to the image of Atlantis as a spiritually advanced civilization rather than simply a powerful empire. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic who lived from 1877 to 1945, gave numerous readings about Atlantis while in trance states, describing advanced technology, including crystal power sources and aerial vehicles, and predicting that Atlantean ruins would be discovered near Bimini in the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969. And when underwater rock formations were found near Bimini around the predicted time, some of Cayce's followers claimed these vindicated his prophecies, though geological investigation determined that the formations were natural rather than artificial. And Cayce's detailed descriptions of Atlantean technology and history, while fascinating to his followers, have no support in ancient texts or archaeological evidence and appear to be products of imagination or unconscious fabrication rather than genuine psychic perception. The 20th century saw Atlantis incorporated into numerous literary and cinematic works, from serious historical novels attempting to reconstruct what Plato might have meant, to adventure stories and science fiction using Atlantis as setting for exciting narratives to children's animated films presenting simplified versions of the legend. And these cultural productions, while not claiming historical accuracy, have shaped public perceptions of what Atlantis was and has contributed to the widespread belief that Atlantis represents not just a story in Plato, but a genuine mystery worthy of serious investigation. The question of what ancient texts really say about Atlantis, then, can be answered relatively simply when we restrict ourselves to actual documentary evidence. Plato wrote the only substantial ancient account describing an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles that attempted to conquer the Mediterranean world around 9600 BCE, was defeated by ancient Athens and then sank beneath the ocean in a catastrophic day and night of earthquakes and floods. No other ancient source independent of Plato mentions this story. All subsequent ancient references either derive from Plato or represent later elaborations and interpretations. No ancient Egyptian texts mention Atlantis, despite Plato's claim that the story came from Egyptian priests, and no archaeological or geological evidence confirms the existence of a large island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean at the time Plato specified. But if we expand our inquiry to ask what ancient texts reveal about the broader context in which the Atlantis story developed and what themes and concerns it reflects, we gain richer understanding. Greek literature and philosophy in the classical period shows deep concern with questions of justice and power, with the relationship between human ambition and divine order, with the instability of human achievements and the dangers of hubris, with ideal political organization and the corruption that threatens even the best governments. And Plato's Atlantis story engages all these themes, using narrative to explore philosophical questions that resist purely logical treatment. Ancient Greek and Near Eastern traditions preserve numerous accounts of catastrophic floods and of lands that disappeared beneath the sea. From the biblical flood narrative to Mesopotamian flood legends, to Greek myths about Deucalion and Pyrrha and the great flood that destroyed humanity except for one virtuous couple, and these widespread flood traditions probably reflect actual historical experiences of coastal flooding and rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, experiences preserved in oral tradition across many generations and eventually written down in various literary forms. And Plato's account of Atlantis sinking might draw on these broader traditions, adapting them for his philosophical purposes, while also preserving genuine memories of environmental changes that occurred in deep prehistory. The archaeological discoveries of the late 19th and 20th centuries revealed that sophisticated civilizations did exist in the Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near East, with impressive architecture, complex social organization, extensive trade networks, and cultural achievements that would have seemed incredible to earlier generations who knew these periods only through fragmentary literary references and scattered artifacts. And these discoveries, particularly of the Minoan civilization on Crete and of Bronze Age cities throughout the Aegean, demonstrated that Plato's general picture of advanced ancient societies was not entirely implausible, even if his specific account of Atlantis remains unverified and probably invented. The geological and climatological evidence indicates that significant environmental changes did occur around the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, with rising sea levels, flooding coastal areas, and low-lying islands, with climate shifts transforming previously habitable regions into deserts or vice versa, with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes affecting settlement patterns, and these changes would have been catastrophic for human populations. Living through them, forcing migrations and adaptations and generating legends that might persist across many generations. And while we cannot connect these actual historical changes to Plato's specific Atlantis story with any confidence, they provide context for understanding why ancient peoples told stories about disappearing lands and great floods. The question remains, if Plato invented Atlantis for philosophical purposes, as most modern scholars believe, why did he present it as historical fact rather than explicitly labeling it as fiction or allegory? Several possible answers suggest themselves. In ancient literature, the boundary between history and fiction was not as clear as modern readers might expect. Historical writing regularly included speeches and dramatic elements that authors invented to make their narratives more compelling, and philosophical writing regularly used myths and stories to illustrate abstract points, and readers were expected to exercise judgment in determining how to interpret different kinds of material. And Plato may have expected his readers to recognize that the Atlantis story, despite being presented as historical, was actually philosophical invention serving illustrative purposes. Alternatively, Plato may have believed that the story did preserve some authentic historical tradition, even if details had been distorted or embellished during transmission, and he may have presented it as true because he thought it was fundamentally true, even if not accurate in every particular. And this interpretation treats Plato as honestly recording what he believed rather than deliberately deceiving readers, though it still leaves open the question of whether the tradition he recorded had any basis in actual events, or was itself a fiction, perhaps created by Solon or by earlier sources. A third possibility is that Plato deliberately created ambiguity about the story's status, presenting it as historical to give it authority and emotional impact, while including enough implausible elements that careful readers would recognize it as fictional. And this reading treats the Atlantis story as a sophisticated literary creation that operates on multiple levels, functioning as entertainment and as philosophical argument, and as a kind of thought experiment, inviting readers to consider how ideal states would function in practice and what threats they would face and how they might be destroyed. The question of what we should make of the Atlantis story today, in the 21st century, when we have access to archaeological and geological evidence that Plato lacked, requires balancing several considerations. We should acknowledge that no convincing evidence has been found for Atlantis as Plato described it, a large island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean that sank around 9,600 BCE, and we should be skeptical of claims that any particular archaeological site or underwater formation represents the real Atlantis, since such claims typically require ignoring or reinterpreting most of Plato's specific details. And we should recognize that the search for Atlantis has often been driven more by desire to find lost wisdom or to confirm predetermined theories than by dispassionate evaluation of evidence. At the same time, we should appreciate the Atlantis story for its literary and philosophical qualities, as one of the great narratives of Western culture that has inspired countless works of art and literature, and that continues to speak to fundamental human concerns about civilization and its fragility, about the relationship between human ambition and divine or natural limits, about the impermanence of even the greatest achievements, and about the possibility that important knowledge might be lost and later recovered, and engaging with Plato's text seriously, reading it carefully and thinking about what it might mean, remains worthwhile regardless of whether Atlantis ever existed as a physical place. We should also maintain openness to the possibility that archaeology and geology might yet discover evidence relevant to the Atlantis story. Not necessarily proof that Plato's account was literally accurate, but perhaps evidence of Bronze Age or Neolithic civilizations that suffered catastrophic destruction and that might have inspired the traditions that Plato recorded, and we should support careful scientific investigation of underwater sites and other locations where ancient settlements might be preserved while maintaining critical standards for evaluating claims and avoiding the temptation to see what we want to see in ambiguous evidence. The enduring power of the Atlantis myth lies not in its historical accuracy, which remains uncertain at best, but in its ability to capture fundamental truths about human experience through narrative form. Civilizations do rise and fall. Powerful empires do collapse. Moral corruption does lead to disaster. Human achievements are vulnerable to natural forces beyond human control, and knowledge accumulated across generations can be lost when societies are disrupted. These patterns, which the Atlantis story illustrates through specific fictional or semi-fictional narrative, represent real historical processes that have occurred repeatedly across human history. And engaging with Plato's story helps us think about these larger patterns and about what they mean for contemporary societies facing our own challenges and vulnerabilities. The Atlantis story also reminds us of the limits of human knowledge and the importance of humility in face of the past's mysteries. We do not know everything about ancient history. Our archaeological knowledge remains incomplete despite impressive discoveries. Oral traditions sometimes preserve authentic information across many generations, though they also distort and embellish. And what seems impossible based on current evidence may turn out to be true when new evidence emerges, though we should not let this openness to possibility slide into credulity that accepts extraordinary claims without adequate proof, and balancing appropriate skepticism with openness to new evidence represents the proper scientific attitude toward questions like Atlantis. As we conclude this extended examination of what ancient texts really say about Atlantis, we must acknowledge that the question admits no definitive answer. The ancient texts, primarily Plato's dialogues, present a story that might be historical truth, distorted by transmission across many generations, or might be philosophical fiction designed to illustrate abstract principles through concrete narrative, or might be something between these extremes, perhaps a story inspired by genuine historical events, but embellished and restructured to serve Plato's literary and philosophical purposes, and without additional evidence that might corroborate or falsify specific claims in the account, we cannot determine which interpretation is correct. What we can say with confidence is that the Atlantis story as told by Plato differs significantly from the elaborate mythology that has developed around it in modern times. Plato did not describe crystal power sources or flying machines or psychic abilities. He described a powerful naval empire with sophisticated but not impossible architecture and technology, organized under constitutional monarchy, initially virtuous but eventually corrupted by ambition and destroyed through natural catastrophe as divine punishment for hubris. And this story, whether historical or invented, serves philosophical purposes that remain relevant, inviting us to think about justice and power, about virtue and corruption, about human achievement and human vulnerability, about the relationship between human will and forces beyond human control. The search for Atlantis will likely continue as long as human beings remain fascinated by mysteries and by the possibility of lost knowledge. And new theories will emerge as new archaeological sites are discovered and as new technologies allow investigation of previously inaccessible underwater locations, and some of these investigations may yield important discoveries about ancient civilizations, even if they do not vindicate Plato's specific account, and the accumulated evidence may eventually allow more confident conclusions about whether Atlantis preserves any historical memory or represents pure philosophical fiction. But regardless of whether Atlantis ever existed as a physical place, the story has achieved a kind of reality through its influence on human culture and imagination, inspiring countless works of literature and art, motivating scientific expeditions, and archaeological investigations, provoking philosophical reflections on civilization and its discontents, and providing a vocabulary for discussing human aspirations and human failures. And in this sense, Atlantis is real, not as a sunken island in the Atlantic, but as an enduring presence in human consciousness, a story that continues to speak to us across 24 centuries, reminding us of the fragility of our achievements and the importance of virtue in maintaining them, warning against the hubris that so often accompanies success, and suggesting through narrative form truths about human nature and human society that resist direct statement, but that we recognize when we encounter them in story. The ancient texts then tell us this. Plato wrote a story about a powerful island civilization that attempted to conquer the ancient Mediterranean world, was defeated by virtuous ancient Athens, and then sank beneath the ocean as divine punishment for moral corruption. Whether this story preserves authentic historical memory or represents philosophical invention remains uncertain and perhaps unknowable given the evidence currently available. What is certain is that the story has captured human imagination for more than 2 millennia, generating speculation and theory and myth that far exceed anything in Plato's original account, and that engaging seriously with what Plato actually wrote, distinguishing his text from later elaborations, represents the essential first step in understanding this enduring mystery, even if that understanding must acknowledge fundamental uncertainties that may never be fully resolved. And perhaps this uncertainty, this inability to know definitively whether Atlantis was real or invented, history or allegory, truth or beautiful fiction, perhaps this very uncertainty is part of the story's power and appeal, for it leaves room for imagination and for hope, for the possibility that somewhere beneath the waves or buried under sand or hidden in some unexplored region, evidence might yet be discovered that would transform legend into history, mystery into knowledge, story into fact. And while we wait for such discovery, if it ever comes, we can engage with the story Plato left us, reading it carefully, thinking about what it might mean, allowing it to raise questions about our own civilization and its vulnerabilities, about the relationship between power and virtue, about the impermanence of human achievements, and about the enduring human need for stories that help us make sense of our experience and that connect us across time to those who came before us and who will come after us, all of us participants in the long human project of building civilizations and trying to make them just and trying to preserve them against the forces, both external and internal, that threaten to destroy what generations have built. And in this project, the story of Atlantis, whether historical or invented, continues to offer wisdom and warning that remain as relevant today as when Plato first wrote them down in Athens, nearly 24 centuries ago. Thank you for spending this night with History Before Sleep stories. May your dreams be calm, your sleep be deep, and your mind return to history whenever you wish to wander again. Good night.